You have written notes? You have written notes? Written notes of class, yeah.
Yes.
What's the last thing you've got? Don't tell them what you had, right? Only two. Go. Just tell me what the last thing is you've got.
Surrender of Sarah Thurston. Kind of didn't take long to,
But is that from the lecture? That's from the PowerPoints?
Yes, sir, that's what I've been doing, trying to do PowerPoint.
Okay, you're doing that on your own. How about you? What's the last thing you've got? You don't have anything?
No.
That's a ghastly affair.
Okay, so, yeah, that's more, the two of you are more aligned, so. We're way behind. I'm gonna have to put the, exam off another day. I was planning to do it, a week from Monday, and we're just not gonna get done in time, so. We're gonna have to do it on a week from today, because I have no way, there's no way in the world I can finish off the American Revolution that fast. So I'm gonna start working. I'll use a couple of PowerPoints here. In your Unit 4, you've got like a set of 3, and obviously you've been through them pretty far. And Saratoga, by the way, is an important issue. That's why I want to be fair to you guys before you have an exam on it. I'm not going to run through it that fast. So I'll start out with the prelude. We'll talk about the things that happened around the time of since the Boston Massacre anyway today. You hear me all right out there in Plainview? I see one lonely person there. Wave your hand. You can hear me okay? So I don't have to yell. I forget that sometimes when I yell and then it makes the speakers buzz. So I'm flashing through slides really fast here to get us up to the Boston Massacre. Looking at some of the names and faces and what have you. The Gaspé Affair follows the Boston Massacre. Gaspé Affair was in 1772 when a British customs cutter down in Narragansett Bay, that's kind of down where Rhode Island is, saw this guy scooting past him in a fast little sailboat and decided that guy's got to be smuggling something. So he went after him with his somewhat larger ship, named the Gaspé, and he's going to go after this guy, but he's going to run into a sandbar and it's going to snap his masts off, and the little boat gets away, but now he's got a new problem. He's got no mast, so no propulsion, so they're going to have to get the boat dragged over close to shore and anchor it, and then the ship's crew is going to disembark and go over and have lunch or something in the local pub. And at some point someone comes out of the pub and they look over to where their ship's anchored and it's on fire. And there's nothing they can do about it. It burns to the waterline. And the British authorities are very, very unhappy about that, and they decide to investigate it, but they can't get anybody to tell them anything. You know, when they ask, well, how'd that ship catch on fire? And some people are saying, well, maybe it was lightning. Of course, it was a sunny day, so it probably wasn't lightning. Maybe somebody tipped over his lantern on the ship. All sorts of excuses, but the fact of the matter is that two men brought some of their friends out to the boat, overpowered the guard on the boat, stole everything off the boat they could take, and set it on fire. The British are never going to get any satisfaction on who did it or what. And those names are not particularly important. There was a guy named Abraham Whipple and a guy named John Brown. Following year, after the dust settled from that a little bit, Virginia was going to send out a suggestion that everyone form a committee of correspondence responsible for the communications between the different colonies. You looking for where we are? On the PowerPoint, it's slide 57.
What's the name of it?
It's called American Revolution Prelude. It's got ultra after it. Okay. What I did was I had this really, really long PowerPoint, and I split it because it was too long for my ultra classes that I'm doing. Let me fix it so you can actually see the slides a little bit better. There's the gas-based slide. Okay. Now something really important is going to happen. I mean, yeah, the state of Virginia said set up committees of correspondence. If you stop and think about it, they had no way of communicating, right? Except for, I don't know, they didn't have anything like Pony Express, but they certainly had nothing electronic, and they had no modern means of communication. So these committees of correspondence were pretty important. And they'll prove that way later on. But also in 1773, England has a problem. It's an economic problem for England. What you might call their biggest cash cow, the place where they get the most profit, isn't from America. America is turning out to be kind of expensive, actually. It's from India. India points east, and it's the East Indies Company, and they're importing tea, which becomes probably one of the most remunerative businesses that the British had. In modern times, we talk about companies that the government has to bail out to save them. We call them too big to fail or too large to fail, because if they fail, they cause trouble to the economy. Well, if any company was like that, it was the British East India Company. So Lord North, the Prime Minister of England, is going to try and figure out a way to bail them out. First of all, he gives them indemnity from going through England to get to America. They can come straight to America. And second, he gives them the right to be the sole sellers of tea. So it won't go through American merchants anymore and then to retailers. It's going to go straight from the ship to the retailers, sold directly to them by the East India Company, and all the American trading houses are cut out of it. So the guys like John, hello? Can you speak, Mr. Hunt? The guys like John Hancock were really upset. It's not just about tea. They're thinking, gee, if they do it with tea, what if they do it about, other things next week and it gets worse and worse? We'll be paupers. So they're really upset about it, and they spread their concern to their friends like the Sam Adams guys and the Sons of Liberty and people like that. And they decide they're just going to boycott tea. They won't buy tea. They'll make homemade stuff that's almost as good as tea, or whatever. Housewives played a big role in this. They're the people that really enforced the boycotts, because they're the ones that did the shopping for families. Now there's pressure on the governor, on Governor Hutchinson. We need the money from that tea. And so finally Hutchinson says, well, if you won't unload the tea from the ships so that you pay the tax on it, we're going to unload it for you, and you're still going to have to pay the tax on it. And the colonists didn't like that very much. And in December of 1773, there's a big meeting on the 16th. Kind of a secret meeting, although there were a lot of people there, and there's never a secret if there's more than 2 people involved. And when the people were coming out, they were telling their friends, hey, if you want to see something neat, come down to the seaport and watch tonight. And sure enough, something neat happened. A bunch of people dressed in kind of strange clothing. I think they were trying to look like Indians, but they hadn't had Indians in Boston for the last 100 years. Maybe not that long, but... And they boarded 3 ships, and they dumped a tremendous amount of tea. They broke the barrels open and dumped the tea into Boston Harbor. There were jokes made all around there that for the next 3 months or so, you couldn't fish in Boston Harbor because the fish all tasted like tea. At any rate, This is December, so it's gonna take a while for news to get back to England. Weather's not really good, it takes a long time for ships to get over there. But they're gonna react, they're really angry. And they pass in Parliament something called the Coercive Acts. That's pretty important, because you could argue that the Coercive Acts were the final thing that drove the Americans into resistance. And basically there were 4 acts. One was called the Boston Port Act. That closed the whole port, which was the lifeblood of Boston. That was their income, period. They also had an act for impartial administration of justice. I just call it on the slides, I call it the Justice Act. There's, by the way, is a neat picture of the Boston Tea Party. How accurate it is, no one knows. By the way, that's a circular up there telling people that we are about to take action. The Boston Port Act shut the port down. The Justice Act, or the Act for the Impartial Administration of Justice, wasn't anything impartial at all. It gave British officials extraterritoriality. What does that mean? It means that you could not put a British official on trial in America. The only place you could try him is back in England. That's a principle, by the way, that carries on to this day. I'll give you an example, a modern time example. When we went into Iraq in Operation Iraqi Freedom, shock and awe and all of that, we stayed there for a period of time. We had an agreement with the new government, but somewhere along the line, when the new government became fully functional, they said, we're not going to sign that agreement anymore. We won't give you extraterritoriality, which meant that American soldiers could be put on trial in an Iraqi court. And that's one of the principal reasons that we didn't send soldiers back, because they wouldn't sign that agreement. Of course, later on, things changed. But anyway, the Americans didn't like the British officials getting extraterritoriality. They also passed the Massachusetts Government Act, which in effect just shut down the assembly in Massachusetts, so they had no government. And the British did everything directly. All the appointments, all the money spending and all that was handled by the British and a royal governor. They still did have a royal governor, Hutchinson, but not for long. Finally, they passed a Quartering Act. They already had some acts like that passed before, but this one's a little bit more severe, and it basically said that while English soldiers are in America, the Americans have to house them and feed them. That gets into a lot of money, gets into people's privacy being invaded, etc., etc. The Americans didn't like that. Those were the coercive acts. The Americans called them the intolerable acts. And they did 2 more things that really upset the Americans. First of all, they told the people of Canada, all of them were actually French Canadians who spoke more French than English, and they were all Catholic. They told them, okay, you guys are now also members of the British Empire. You have all the rights of subjects of the King of England, which really bothered the colonists down in Massachusetts, because that meant that they were on an equal standing with these French people, and they would be in competition with them for, new territory and all of that. To you and me, it sounds like a silly little thing, but to them it was a big deal. And finally, they said, okay, you folks don't like Governor Hutchinson, so we're going to help you out. We're going to take him away from you. He won't be your governor anymore. We're going to replace him with our friend, our trusted friend, Thomas Gage. And he will now be the governor of Massachusetts province. He and several thousand of his closest friends, all who have guns, because of course Thomas Gage was the general that was in charge of all British troops in North America. So basically, they put Massachusetts under martial law. What are the results of this? There's some pretty big results. One is that some of the other colonies start feeling sorry for Boston in particular, Massachusetts in general, and they're gonna start shipping food up to Boston overland, since their port's closed. Another is that the leaders of most of the colonies are gonna get together and say, we really need to talk this over. Does anyone say the word independence? No. No one's talking about independence. They're talking about dealing with the British government and solving the tax problem and all these other problems that are arising. The First Continental Congress is going to start meeting on the 5th of September, 1774. They meet in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. They kind of dither around. They've never done anything like this before. No. Almost all of the colonies are represented. One colony can't get there in time, that's Georgia. Not too far away. 12 colonies are represented. There's a painting of that, one of those early meetings. So they start on the 5th of September. It won't be until the 16th when a young silversmith that we hear about when we're reading history by the name of Paul Revere shows up with a document from Suffolk County, Massachusetts. It's the Suffolk County Council, I guess you'd call it. And they've written some suggestions to the Continental Congress. Resolutions, as it were, and they always use the word the resolves. These are the Suffolk resolves. And basically, they tell the Continental Congress, here's our recommendations. 4 of them. Where are they? Here they are. Disobey the coercive act. Refuse to pay taxes to the royal government. Elect militia officers. Learn the art of war. In other words, start military training. We didn't have any professional soldiers. That's pretty extreme. On the 20th of October, another group is formed called the Continental Association. Some of them were part of the Continental Congress. They were all merchants. And they came up with the idea, I think one of them was Robert Morris, we'll talk about him more. They came up with the idea of we know how to hurt the British and make them back down on this. I shouldn't say the British because they consider themselves English too. But their idea was let's boycott their goods. Don't buy anything from them. Hurt them in the pocketbook. It was effective, by the way. So Congress talks that over too. And on the 26th of October, they conclude. They've conducted a certain amount of business. One is they make a Declaration of American Rights, which they send over to Parliament. Another one is they vote to endorse the Suffolk Resolve. Let's adopt that policy. Their new policy will be boycott British goods. If that doesn't work after a year, we'll stop selling stuff to the British as well. Of course, a year's not going to pass before other things happen. Lord North, in February of 1775, reacting to what he hears from the Continental Congress, sends what he calls a conciliatory resolution to them. Hey guys, no reason to get all upset. I've got a real deal to offer you. And what he proposes is that from now on, when they collect tax from the Americans, the taxes will remain in America. Sounds pretty nice. They're not taking the money away from us. Until you think about it, they've got several thousand British troops in America too. They're going to use those taxes to pay for them. That's no, benefit to the Americans. He proposes that those taxes will only be to regulate trade, not to gather money. But then he says, and if we do these wonderful things for you, you have to contribute to the cost of the British official presence in America. So, turns out to be not such a deal at all, and the Americans basically throw it in the trash can. Some people, especially up in New England, were taking the Suffolk results pretty seriously, and they're starting to do little military training in the different villages. And they're starting also to stockpile things like gunpowder, lead, occasional weapons. And British has pretty good intelligence, and they know what's going on. And it's reported to England, and England comes back with a nasty gram to General Gage saying, well, why are you sitting on your butt doing nothing about it? And so finally he's forced to take action he really didn't want to do. And on the evening of the 18th of April, in the small hours of the 19th of April, he's going to send a force of 700 British regulars inland looking for a stockpile that they've had reports on that's located in a little town called Concord, Massachusetts. See if I've got a map. There's a good map of it. So you got Boston there. They send their troops over to the Charleston Peninsula, and they're going to march up the road to Lexington first and then to Concord. When they get to Lexington, and I'm not sure the sun was up yet, there's a group of militia lined up in formation at the town square, and the British are wondering, how did they know we were coming? Anybody guess how they knew we were coming from things I've told you before? Any thoughts? Let me see if I can find what I think the answer to that question is. Right there. That's General Gage's wife. She's a good Joycey girl. She's an American. When the general was doing his planning with his staff and all that, they're doing it in her living room. She has a doctor. His name is Warren. It's the general's doctor too. He's an American. And he's a member of the most patriotic of the patriotic groups. So I can imagine that it went from the mouths of the British generals into Mrs. Warren's ears, and from her mouth to Dr. Warren, Mrs. Gage's ears rather, and from her mouth to Dr. Warren's ears, and onward. What we know is that young silversmith that I mentioned a minute ago, Paul Revere, and some of his friends, there's another guy named Dawkins, and some others, they set up what we would in modern days call a telephone chain. And the deal was, when we find out that the British are actually coming, we'll split up and we'll go to different places on the mainland, and then people that we meet will spread the word too, and then we'll get out to all the area that the British are on the way. And that, in fact, is what they did. Paul Revere gets caught, by the way, doing this. The British arrest him briefly, but they don't really charge him for anything because they're not really sure what he's doing but riding his horse around fast. They couldn't give him a speeding ticket. I don't think they did those things. At any rate, they're going to march to Lexington. When they get to Lexington, someone's going to fire a gun. We don't know if it was a British soldier who had an accident or an American. There was no major battle or anything like that. The British officer in command was a lieutenant colonel named Francis Smith. They're going to keep right on marching to Concord. When they get to Concord, they're going to bump into some more militia. And the colonel divides his forces up a little bit to send one group up north of town, one group south of town, looking for the weapons cache. They're pretty sure it's up north of town. They go to a farm up there, and apparently they've had reports it's on this farm, and they dig around in the farm. They go through all the barns and all the storage sheds and places like that, search a farmer's house. They don't find anything. So they turn around to come back into Concord. On the way back in, the road narrows, there's a bridge, and they've got to go across that bridge. And right where the road narrows, they get ambushed by a bunch of militiamen. The militiamen who had faded away in front of the British apparently reassembled up there. There's some gunfire, there's some people wounded, a few people killed, but the young officer that's in command of this group of British soldiers keeps them in order and finishes marching back into Concord and joins Colonel Smith's unit. I think when the first shot was fired in Lexington, Colonel Smith already sent a messenger back to Boston saying, I think I'm going to need some help. At any rate, Gage sends out 1,000 more British soldiers, and they get to Lexington about the time Colonel Smith's coming back into Lexington from Concord, and they turn around to march back into Boston. So they're about 1,700 strong. And the strange thing that's happening is they walk along the road from Concord to Lexington, and then from Lexington to Boston, is there's more and more people out there in the woods shooting at them. Can't see them. They're out there hiding behind trees and stuff and taking pot shots at the British. And the British would return fire, except they don't really have any targets. So they keep on marching. And I'm sure they weren't very happy. They got back to Boston. And these militiamen followed them when they went back to Boston and kind of set up outposts at the places where you would normally come out of Boston to go inland. So now you more or less got the British bottled up in this town, which is almost an island. Is it the beginning of a war? Well, not really. The British aren't looking at it as a war. They're looking at it as an incident that they have to take some kind of measures about. So they're going to kind of be forted up in Boston. As soon as this all happens, the Continental Congress is going to meet again. It'll be the Second Continental Congress. This time, they're not going to go home and be finished. They'll stay in session. Right about the same time they meet, two young Americans, very different. One of them's a young militia officer named Benedict Arnold. The other one is actually a land speculator named Ethan Allen. He's from up where Vermont is now. Vermont didn't exist as a state or anything then. There's always been a fight in between Massachusetts and New York, who owned the land out behind them. And Ethan Allen was making his money by backing one side and running people off from the other state. So he had this gang of people that they called the Green Mountain Boys, but they were basically a bunch of thugs who scared people off their farms. But they're handy to have around. And Ethan Allen, totally separately from Benedict Arnold, they both come up with the idea, we need cannons, we don't have any artillery. If we're going to fight a war or do anything like that, we have a disadvantage. Benedict Arnold goes to George Washington, who's one of the representatives of Virginia at the Continental Congress, and he tells him about this idea, and Washington says, well, I don't have any money to give you, but if you want to have a shot at it, go for it. Then Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold gripe about who's in charge and all of that sort of thing. But they march on up to Lake Champlain, and they go to two English forts. The English had set up these forts during the French and Indian War after chasing the French out of there. And they had cannons and other things there, and they left them behind when they pulled out, and they left just small units there to watch over them. And the idea that Allen and Arnold both had was it won't take very many armed men to take that away from them. Then we can grab all the stuff they've got there. And that's what they did. In fact, I think it was the 10th of May, the same day that the Continental Congress was coming back into session, they took Fort Ticonderoga, and they took all the munitions they found there. We're talking about cannons, howitzers. What's a howitzer compared to a cannon? A cannon is a breech-loading weapon. A howitzer is not a breech-loading, it's a muzzle-loading weapon. A howitzer is a breech-loading weapon. It loads from the rear. Also mortars. They're very effective weapons. They shoot explosive bombs up in the air. This is announced to the Continental Congress, and they're quite pleased. Those guns disappear. We'll see them again. See if you can tell me when we see them again. George Washington is named to be the leader, their military leader. They're going to form an army we'll call the Continental Army, named after the Continental Congress. They didn't have a country yet, right? They were just the people who lived on the continent. George Washington got the job on the 15th of June. On the 17th of June, General Gage comes out on his porch and looks over across the water at the Charleston Peninsula, and up on top of a couple of hills, he notices people doing stuff up there. What they're doing is they're building fortifications up there, and they're not British Army. So he gives orders to General Howe and General Clinton, do something about this. We can't have them up above us looking down on us. So they take 2,200 men over there, and we end up with the Battle of Bunker Hill. Strangely enough, the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought on Breed's Hill. There was a Bunker Hill up there, but it was the next hill over, and somebody just got the name wrong and went into the history books that way. That'll happen again in our history. It'll happen in Cuba when we talk about San Juan Hill and Teddy Roosevelt. Anyway, let's take a look, see what I've got on this. Boy, how did I end up way back there? Oh, I know why. Because I'm running out of... I don't have it on the set. We're going to move the next slide, which is first shots to Monmouth. It's in the same location. It's right next to that set. It kind of repeats some of the stuff that we've just talked about, but it talks about the Battle of Bunker Hill. It also talks about Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold going up to Lake Champlain to the two forts. Here's kind of a diagram of what Bunker Hill looked like. Down below, whoops, you can't see it, can you? Down below is Boston. And the British landed on the Charleston Peninsula with, nobody kept them from landing there. And they marched around the city. They didn't go through the little city of Charleston. And they advanced on Breed's Hill, which had the most people up on top. And they thought, well, this will be an interesting afternoon exercise, and they just marched up the hill, and they were shocked when they were driven off the hill by gunfire. So they reformed down at the bottom of the hill, and they marched up again. And lo and behold, they were driven off the hill again, and they were starting to take casualties. Lots of them. By the time the fighting was over, they'd taken 50% casualties. That doesn't mean 50% were killed. It means 50% were at least wounded. On the third attempt, they finally take the hill. That's because the colonists who were up on top of the hill ran out of ammunition. And they quickly made arrangements that a few guys would stay behind to try and slow the British down with whatever was left of gunpowder and whatever. The rest of them would skedaddle. They went over across Bunker Hill, collected all the guys there, and they took off and disappeared into the woods. The British, when they came up the hill, were fighting a much smaller force who were reduced to throwing rocks and things like that at the end. The British were very angry. They advanced with bayonets. They killed everybody up there. I don't think they took any prisoners. One particular fellow that was killed was Dr. Joseph Warren. Remember him? Joseph Warren was made a major general in the militia, Massachusetts militia. And they said, "You're in command on Breed's Hill." But he said, "I'm no soldier. Israel Putnam knows about fighting from the French and Indian War. Put him in command and I'll fight as a private. I don't need to be a general." And that's what he did. And he was one of the people who remained behind on that hilltop, and the British chopped him into pieces with bayonets, stuffed him in a hole in the ground. Not a very dignified way to go. and got control of the hills and the whole peninsula. So in theory, it was a victory for the British, but they'd suffered over 50% casualties. And this is going to have a lot of different significances. One thing, the immediate thing it taught the British Army was, don't go after Americans who are on top of hills with guns. Or at least do it carefully. Because they hadn't used artillery, they had ships there, they could have fired cannons at the hilltop, and they didn't do any of that. Big mistake. But other things that happened that are consequences of Bunker Hill were political and economic as well as military. The king was furious. Now Parliament, which was usually divided, some people say be nice to the Americans, some people didn't want to be nice to them. Now they all want reprisals for this attack on English soldiers. The king declares New England to be in rebellion in August. They stew a while over that. In October, the king declares all of the American colonies to be in rebellion. When you get to December, I don't know if I have a slide of it here. Yeah, I do. The English passed the Prohibitory Act, which basically says you can't do business with any of the American colonies. If you do, and we catch you, you'll lose your ship, you'll lose your cargo, and maybe your freedom as well. They signed that into law on the 22nd of December. By the way, not long after this, our friend General Gage is going to get fired. See if I can find the slide. Gage on it. There it is. Put the slide in the wrong place. General Gage gets fired. General Howe will take over. They thought Thomas Gage was quite a bit too soft on the Americans, perhaps because of his wife. Now General Howe is in charge, and he's kind of bottled up in Boston. We mentioned the attack on Quebec, right? Did I talk about that? Before all of this happened, well, right about the same time, a little bit later, the Americans get the idea maybe the French Canadians would like to join the war on our side. But they're, of course, under the control of the British Army up there. So they send Benedict Arnold. Looking for a slide of it, that's why I'm jumping all around here. Let's see if I can find it. I guess I don't have a slide. They send Benedict Arnold and under the command of a colonel named Montgomery. Benedict Arnold was a little bit hyperactive, and they decided to put another guy in charge. Arnold was a very dynamic leader. He's going to take this incredible march through the winter snow and all of that, all the way up to Quebec from Boston. Partway they go on water, but they went for a long way on the land. He's going to get up there with his force intact. He and Montgomery and a colonel by the name of Daniel Morgan from Virginia are going to attack Quebec, hoping that the British will be quickly subdued and that the French will rise up and throw the rest of the British out. It doesn't work out that way. Colonel Montgomery is killed. Benedict Arnold is wounded pretty badly in one leg. Daniel Morgan and Benedict Arnold are captured by the British. So it was a major debacle, not successful. This happens in December. So Bunker Hill was in June. Eventually, Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan will both be released by the British. It's a prisoner exchange because the Americans, somewhere down the line, capture some British officers and they swap. That happened quite often in the American Revolution. Gage is gone, Howe's in charge, and Howe's stuck in Boston. And the war is officially begun. Memorize this map and you know everything that happened in the war. Maybe. Let's talk about that one there. It's slide 13, I think, on this set. Let's talk about the British strengths and weaknesses. They had 50,000 men available. They weren't all there yet, but they were available. Trained soldiers. They had the world's strongest navy. By the way, the king wasn't satisfied with 50,000, and he went over to Europe and he employed 30,000 more soldiers, mercenaries from Hesse and Hanover and Saxony. So that made 80,000 really. They're not all there yet. They had experienced political leaders, maybe not the brightest of the leaders, but experienced political leaders. They had pretty good generals. They were all professionals. Probably not their first string of generals. Their first string was over fighting in Ireland. They were a long way from home, so their supply line was pretty long unless they could get supplies locally. They had good weapons and pretty much a limitless supply of weapons. They had great transportation in the Royal Navy. They could move up and down the coast really quickly. One thing against them was time. And even back then people recognized when you send your soldiers overseas, after a while the people at home start complaining about it, and before long your own people stop supporting the war. So you need to finish the war off before that happens. So time was a bit against them. They had no problem with money. They had plenty of money. But their strategy, it was a difficult strategy. What they really had to do to win this war was to sit on all of the colonies. Kind of like a giant game of whack-a-mole. You hit them one place and they pop up somewhere else. So you have to sit on all the places at the same time. Think 80,000 soldiers. I can't tell you an area, but it seems to me that if you took the state of Virginia and maybe the state of Maryland, they'd be bigger than Vietnam. And we had 500,000 soldiers, and they couldn't sit on all of Vietnam. So there's no way, and modern weapons, there's no way in the world that the British could really sit on all those provinces. So you could argue from the very beginning, there's no way they were going to do this if the Americans continued to have the will to fight. On the American side, what kind of advantages and disadvantages? Their army was really small compared to the British. They had maybe as many as 16,000 available militiamen who weren't trained very well and might or might not follow orders. They had some pretty good political leadership. People like George Washington and John Jay and Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, probably the smartest man in all of North America. They didn't have any tested military leaders, really. Even when they fought in the French and Indian War, they never were allowed to have high rank. Their weapons, whatever you've got at home, basically. They didn't really have any artillery except that one bunch of artillery that they swiped up on Lake Champlain. They didn't have a trouble with transportation because they were fighting at home. They didn't need to go anywhere. Time was on their side. Why? Why would time be on their side? Because just for the reasons that I mentioned before, all they needed to do was hold out until the British people got tired of it and went away and left them alone. And in your lifetime and in my lifetime, you've seen this repeated over and over again. You send troops to somebody else's territory, unless you can actually sit on them and totally control them, you can't win. Because sooner or later you're going to get tired, you're going to go home. All they have to do is survive. So time was on the side of the colonies. They didn't have much money to start with. In fact, one man's going to finance most of the war. We'll talk about him. Robert Morris was his name. So all their strategy had to be was stalemate. A tie goes to the Americans. They didn't have to defeat the entire British Army. They didn't have to go over to England and capture London or anything like that. So all they had to do was fight to a draw, and that was a win for them. Why people can't study history and figure that out in general purposes, I don't know. Why you can map out every war and tell who's going to win at the beginning, and yet we don't do that, do we? Anyway, we're at the end of 1775. In January of 1776, a funny guy, I think he started out being a tailor as a young man, then he turned out to be a writer, a pamphleteer, a revolutionary. It's kind of a hobby. He wrote a little tract called Common Sense. It was printed and published. He sent it to a Philadelphia newspaper, and they printed it and published it. And basically, it was the first written argument, the first time that anyone dared to actually write it down. And it was logical, a list of logical reasons why the colonies shouldn't be under the control or belong to England. It wasn't nasty or anything like that. It was just, here's the reasons why these colonies should be independent of England. The big significance of it, there were several. One was that it got more Americans to agree with that point of view. And the other one was, it was the first time anyone dared to do that. Because the English could interpret that as being treason. We still got General Howe and his friends all gathered in Boston, and some of their loyalist friends there, and the people that liked the English government and that have you, what have you. And then one day General Howe comes out in the morning. I don't know if it was in the morning or not, but it feels good to say that. Having his tea, looking around, looks over at Charleston, all's well in Charleston, turns and looks south, and looks up at the top of Dorchester Heights. Really high hills on the coastline, on a little peninsula just south of Boston. And it is bristling with what? What's on top of Dorchester Heights, guys, that I told you you would forget before I got to it? Oh, it couldn't have been 15 minutes ago, and I said you're going to forget it before I get there. What would you imagine was on Dorchester Heights? Anybody? All the cannons they got on Lake Superior. All the weapons. Mortars, howitzers, cannons. An intrepid man by the name of Henry Knox somehow gets them all the way from Lake Superior onto boats on the coast and sneaks them down there right under the nose of the English, right past the British Navy. And quietly one night they tie stuff around the wheels of the wheels of the carriages of the cannons and things like that, so that they don't make a loud noise. Hauls them up, mainly by manpower, to the top of Dorchester Heights. Then points them all down at Boston. Now General Howe has a choice to make. We've got two options here, because we can't survive with those guns pointing downhill on us. So what do we do? Option one, go up Dorchester Heights and take it away from them, kind of like Bunker Hill. Not a really good idea. And now they've got cannons, not just pop guns. Or we better leave. And he took the second option. Loaded everything up on the ships that were parked all around Boston, all the military ships, and some of their loyalists, and they skedaddled for Halifax, Nova Scotia. And so a lot of people would like to say, ha, the war's over. When of course it wasn't. In Halifax, they'll start reorganizing, waiting for more reinforcements to show up, waiting for some of the German mercenaries to show up. They'll be back. But they won't come back to Boston because they didn't like all those guns up on Dorchester Heights. So they're going to come back to New York instead. They're going to use their Navy. You know, a lot of New York is islands. There's Staten Island and Manhattan and Long Island. That's all part of New York. And the southern tip of Long Island is part of New York City. They're going to come down to New York. In fact, right about the time that they come down to New York, we're going to finish approving and publishing a document called the Declaration of Independence. That is officially approved and published on the 4th of July. They hemmed and hawed over it for some weeks before then. And on the 2nd of July, a member of the Continental Congress named Henry Lee is going to propose we've got to come out and say it out loud. We're fighting for independence. This is the first time where basically all the people in the Continental Congress even think about independence. They've been thinking about it over the past months, but I mean, they finally come to an agreement. People like John Dickinson, the guy that wrote Letters of a Farmer of Pennsylvania, he's not really sure about this. You know, he thinks maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But eventually they all decide, no, we're going to issue this declaration on the 4th of July. Already on the 2nd of July, and this may be something that spurred them along, the British have hit New York. They attack Staten Island, they land troops on Long Island, start marching down Long Island. I think they got Staten Island first. They showed up with about 33,000 British soldiers. They're not talking about 6,000 or 5,000, 33,000. And some Germans. George Washington's got what? He's got an army, if you want to call it that, to defend New York of about 19,000 men. Lord knows how they'll work as an army. And the British decide to be cautious. They learned their lesson at Bunker Hill. And methodically, what they're going to do, they're going to use their navy, they're going to try and go up the Hudson River, they're going to advance their army, and they're going to try and surround George Washington and his army and wipe them out. Only they do it a little bit too slowly and deliberately, and there's little roadblocks along the way. Some American officers were able to stop them from going forward a couple of times. Let me see if I can find a decent map. There's a painting of the Battle of Long Island, which who knows if it's anywhere near the truth. If you look at this map here, the third thing down on the map is Governor's Island. One thing that happened was Henry Knox put a bunch of artillery on Governor's Island so that the British ships would have trouble sailing up the Hudson Bay or going in between Manhattan and Brooklyn. So they couldn't really get around behind Washington. Some ships got through, and they're going to start shooting at Washington there. But there's a major battle, the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. Washington will hold for a while and then have to pull back. And he only got out of New York because he had a couple of young generals who were really hard-headed and fought really hard to stop the English. And they were able to slow them down enough so Washington had time to get across the Hudson River into New York State and then move over to New Jersey. So by the end of the year, he's in New Jersey. It was a close call. I mean, his army was no army at all. There were people that were willing to fight, but they weren't trained. There's a kind of a drawing of him withdrawing over across the Hudson River over into Fort Lee, and then he'll move south into New Jersey. But he's only able to stop because of a couple of American generals. Washington will get away with General Greene, General Putnam, and General Mercer. General Sullivan, John Sullivan, holds out until the bitter end, and he's finally captured by the British. There's another general named Charles Lee. He's captured by the British. Later on, they'll be traded. I told you, in this war, there's a lot of trades of prisoners. This all happens in November of 1776. Now, before that, in September, Richard Howe, who's the commander of his younger brother, he's going to have an idea that maybe we can, now that we're here in force and they can see how many people we have, the Continental Congress will whistle a different tune. So he takes General Sullivan, who's already been captured, and he says, I want you to go to the Continental Congress, tell them I want to talk to someone who has the power to negotiate. General Sullivan says, I can't do that. I can't do that because that would be assisting the enemy, that would be treason to my cause. So Admiral Howe tells him, okay, give me your parole, you're still a prisoner. I will send you with a British officer, so you're still his prisoner, and you can march down to the Congress, but I need someone to talk to the Congress. They can keep my officer as a hostage and send somebody to talk to me. And in fact, the Congress does that. They keep the hostage. They send John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge. It's not going to work. They sit down for a meal. The problem is, Howe is willing to offer them almost anything they want except total independence. And Benjamin Franklin and John Adams have got instructions from the Continental Congress. The only thing you can agree to is independence. So when that came out on the table, they realized this wasn't going to work. And the three men went back to the Congress to report. They released the hostage, sent him back to the English side. They sent General Sullivan back because he'd given his parole, so he couldn't escape. They don't do that anymore. In fact, then there was this thing called honor. We've kind of forgotten what honor means. He was a prisoner, but the British, the first time they had the chance, because he'd acted honestly, the first time they got the chance when they had a prisoner exchange, he was one of the guys they exchanged, and he rejoined George Washington. That was the Staten Island Peace Conference. Those are more maps. That's Washington's retreat. Kind of a confusing map, don't worry about it. It was confusing. Washington got away with, at least 15,000 men, maybe more. But the problem was, they'd never stop and fight. I mean, he had them in fairly good positions on hills several times when General Cornwallis was coming after him, and they'd hang around long enough to take one shot, and then they'd run like rabbits. Washington couldn't stop them from running, so they learned to go with the flow. At least he kept them together all over New Jersey. The only good thing about this was the British started getting tired of chasing him, and they're going to chase him until the end of the year. In December, Washington's going to go further south. He's going to cross the Delaware River and set up camps in Pennsylvania. That puts him closer to the Continental Congress, by the way, too. The British are going to decide it's too late in the year, and they're going to set up camps all over New Jersey. Then an interesting thing happens. By the way, General Sullivan had managed already to rejoin Washington. Another general named Charles Lee had rejoined him with a group of soldiers that were held out up north. And Sullivan and General Greene come to Washington, and they tell General Washington, right across the river from us, I'll show you a diagram of it. Where is it? Right across the river from us, there's Washington over here, his main army. On the other side of the river, down the river a bit, is a little town called Trenton. And the British have an outpost there. Their main forces are way far away, but their outpost is there to watch Washington. And they're all German soldiers. They're all Hessians. And the idea that Sullivan and Greene have is these guys, it's Christmas. Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, and Germans like to tip the cup a little bit. He says they probably won't be in any shape to fight on Christmas Day or the day after. And they persuade Washington to cross back over the river and attack them. And they do that. There's a famous picture of it. And I'm sure that it's nothing like the truth, because it was raining and sleeting and it was nasty weather and the water was rough and all of that, and I'm sure George Washington wasn't standing like this out in front of a boat like that. He wasn't stupid. Those are pictures of General Greene on the left. To his right is General Sullivan, and down below is, leaning on a cannon, of course, is the Chief of Artillery, Henry Knox. They attacked the Hessians. who were, in fact, not in good shape. He killed 22 of them, wounded 98 of them, and captured 1,000 Hessian soldiers. They also sent some troops up a little bit further north to Princeton to try and get a rise out of the British Army, get them to come to a place where the Americans could attack them. It didn't work, so they had to come back down south. They went back across the Delaware River, and they're going to spend their winter in Pennsylvania. Probably slide a little bit closer to Philadelphia. The British are going to spend their winter up there, and the British are going to decide during the winter or in the spring, we've got to come at this a little bit differently. This chasing them all around New Jersey isn't going to work. And the local people weren't helping out very much either. So they come up with a plan. Kind of a neat looking plan. You always worry about plans because no plan ever works after, once the shooting starts, the plan goes down the drain. This plan was to send one army group all the way up to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, sail them upstream on the St. Lawrence until they get to the Richelieu River, drop down to Lake Champlain, which we've talked about in conjunction with Ticonderoga and Crown Point and the cannons. They'll come down that lake, use it to get all the way into the heartland of New York. Then Clinton, once they get there, once they capture, say, Albany, Clinton will come north from New York. At the very same time, or maybe a little bit before that, the senior general, General Howe, will sail all the way down to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, all the way up to the north end of the Chesapeake Bay. It's a long bay, by the way. It's like an ocean if you're in the middle of it. You can't see the shore anywhere. They're going to sail up. They'll land somewhere as close to Philadelphia as they can get. They'll take Philadelphia. They'll capture the Continental Congress, and the war will be over. And then when they get done with Philadelphia, they'll go up and join Burgoyne and Clinton. They will have chopped New England right off of all the other colonies, captured the Continental Congress, and they can all go home happy. We're not really sure who came up with the plan. Burgoyne he was kind of a glory seeker. He also liked women and alcohol. Nothing against that, I guess. He brought them along with him, though, when he was fighting. But Howe has given orders, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do. So he sets off. Where is it on the slide? He sails to a place that they called Head of Elk. It was actually on the Elk River. The Elk River flowed into the Chesapeake Bay. He's going to sail there and land in Maryland. He thought about going closer to Philadelphia on the Delaware River, but decided the Americans all know that's the way I'll be coming, so they'll be ready for us. So let's come from a little bit further inland. He's going to meet with Washington, who advances out of Philadelphia to stop him from taking Philadelphia. He meets with Washington and he whoops him pretty bad. In fact, Washington almost got captured. Almost got cut off from the main part of his army. With the efforts of John Sullivan, who had returned to him, William Alexander, a cavalry general named Casimir Pulaski, never guess where he came from. He was recruited over in France. He was a Polish cavalry officer. He made the American cavalry. He built it up, trained them and all of that. Also Nathaniel Greene. They blocked the British long enough for Washington to get away. But they're not going to be able to stop the British from going into Philadelphia, and they'll enter the city on the 26th of September, 1777. Washington's going to camp in a valley about 25 miles away that we'll later call Valley Forge. So Howe's in Philadelphia. General Burgoyne has already sailed up to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. He's come down to the Richelieu River, that's in between Quebec and Montreal. He makes his way down the Richelieu River or up, depending on whether you call it upstream or down because he's going south. He'll make his way all the way to Lake Champlain. He's taking his sweet time getting there because he knows it's going to take Howe a long time to get up to Philadelphia and then come up and help him. He notices a problem as they go south. They have to forage for supplies, and the further south they go, the harder it is to get supplies. They're actually having to fight to get into some of the places. He's met by an American force, not directly, but kind of indirectly, an American force under General Horatio Gates, who has under his command another general named Benjamin Lincoln, another general named Benedict Arnold, and a colonel named Daniel Morgan, and all their men. It's not a very big army. Probably a few more men than Burgoyne has. They're going to fight a battle. They're out foraging for food, and one unit from Burgoyne's army is going to bump into Americans. They were pretty well placed and led by Benedict Arnold and others. And they're going to get a bloody nose. They'll eventually capture the place they want to capture, but it cost them a little bit. Then they're going to go back to the main unit. And a funny thing starts happening. From Vermont, or the area that we now call Vermont, it wasn't Vermont yet, from Vermont and New York and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, people start trickling in to join the Americans. They're just coming from home. And by the 1st of October, the Americans have an army of 30,000 men, and old Burgoyne has got 6,000 men. See how this is working out. Burgoyne, by the way, you can't overlook this because it's kind of neat. On his way down, he dispatched a colonel by the name of Barry Ledger in a unit, I don't know how, 100 men or more, to go all the way up the St. Lawrence River, to go to Lake Ontario, land at a place called Fort Oswego, and recruit Canadians and American Indians to fight on the side of the British, and to take all these people back into the heart of New York and meet Burgoyne there. And the Americans find out about that pretty easily. And so Benedict Arnold, with a group of about 800 men, is dispatched to stop this big force that's coming in from the west. He marches all the way, roughly from Saratoga, New York, all the way to Fort Stanwix, which is a little bit more than halfway to the Great Lakes. This is a guy who's got a hole in one leg from his fight up in Quebec, and it's still not healed. I guess he got to ride on a horse most of the way, but still. I mean, if you were to drive from Albany to Fort Stanwix now, it'd still take you a long time to get there. These guys were walking. They got all the way up there. They bluffed the British and the Indians into thinking they were a really big unit. The Indians took off and said they're going hunting. It's hunting season, it's time to go. The Canadians weren't really ambitious to get in a fight. And so Barry St. Ledger had to turn around and go back to Lake Ontario, and we don't see him again. Now it's Burgoyne and 6,000 men by himself, and he's counting the bad guys on the other side there, the Americans, and he realizes he's probably not going to get any help from General Clinton or General Howe because he's been sending messengers screaming for help, and he's not getting any answers to his messages. So he makes up his mind that he's going to have to break through the encirclement. He looks for a weak place in the encirclement. There's a hill called Bemis Heights. And he's going to send a brigadier general. Where is he? Simon Fraser is his name. And what he wants him to do is hit this weak point in the American lines and break through so the rest of the army can go through it. And he actually does pretty well. He's not a bad leader at all. The only thing is that he believes in leading from the front, and that led to his downfall. Now, Horatio Gates rewarded Benedict Arnold for marching all the way to Fort Stanwix and all the way back by putting him under arrest. They had an argument, and I think probably Benedict Arnold and I would agree about Horatio Gates was he was a big puffball that never got anything done. Benedict Arnold, on the other hand, was almost hyperactive. So he's under guard in his tent. He doesn't have any soldiers working for him anymore. and he hears the battle going on at Bemis Heights, and he realizes things aren't going well for the Americans. So finally he just leaves his tent, tells the guard, shoot me if you will, and just keeps walking. The guard's not going to shoot him. He joins Daniel Morgan, who's got a bunch of Virginia sharpshooters. They have long rifles, not muskets. They're accurate. He's looking over there at the enemy as they're approaching, and he sees this man on a big black charger waving his sword around, leading his soldiers into battle. And he says to Daniel Morgan, shoot that fellow. Daniel Morgan, I think, was a little bit aghast. He didn't think that was a gentlemanly thing to do. But Arnold says, no, shoot him. Order one of your sharpshooters to shoot him. So they do. It's General Fraser. He goes down. He's mortally wounded. He dies. And his army that was advancing very successfully falls into disarray and confusion. At which time Benedict Arnold says, now attack them. Nobody volunteered. So Benedict Arnold steals a horse, grabs somebody's sword, and goes out in front of the Americans and says, let's go. And they follow him. And they drive the British back. The British start to run all the way back to their positions that they'd left in the morning when they started the attack. Benedict Arnold gets his horse shot out from under him. Well, not out from under him. He gets shot through the leg, and the horse is also shot, and the horse falls on him. He's pinned under the horse for a while. I think he was heard to say, damn, it's the same leg. The leg that he got shot in up at Quebec. He'll be permanently crippled as a result of that. But General Burgoyne decides there's no way I'm breaking through these Americans. And on the 7th of October, he surrenders. This is a major surrender of English troops. 6,000 men we captured. But that's not the significance of this. By the way, Horatio Gates is taking credit for what everybody else did. They did the fighting, he did the watching. He sends his messenger, a guy by the name of James Wilkinson, who is a real lowlife. He's a colonel who's the general's aide. And James Wilkinson goes all the way to the Continental Congress to say, General Gates won the Battle of Saratoga. He should be in charge of all American forces, not that guy Washington who hasn't won any battles. The Congress promoted Wilkinson to Brigadier General. What a lowlife. Gates was kind of a slimy guy too, but Wilkinson was worse. We'll talk about him much later. We'll talk about him when Thomas Jefferson is president. He's still around. Teflon man. Anyway, Burgoyne surrenders. What is the significance of this all? For several years now, Benjamin Franklin's been in France trying to get the French to enter the war on our side. And the French are saying, we're not throwing money after a lost cause. They give us some money secretly, but they're not going to help us fight the war. You know, they'd already had the French and Indian War. They weren't anxious to get involved again. Until the Battle of Saratoga. When they heard about the surrender of General Burgoyne, then they started thinking, maybe these people could win. It's always good to back a winning side. And they agreed to a treaty, to two treaties with the Americans. And they call themselves the United States. One was a treaty of friendship and trade, which was valuable to us. But much more valuable, they signed a treaty of military alliance and promised troops and naval support and money. We're out of time. I want you to mull this over. Why did they do that? Did they do that because they loved liberty and democracy and independence and things like that? Remember, the ruler of France is a king. Right? Did he support all of that? Why did they help us? Because they loved the Americans? Lafayette did. He loved the idea. And we haven't talked about him, and I'll have to talk about him in a minute. Why did they support us? Any thoughts? Think about, what did they just lose in 1763? All their possessions in North America. So if the Americans won the war, what do you think they might be thinking they'd get their foot in the door of? Maybe we can get back into North America. I mean, this will be a weak country, maybe we can make them dependent on us, and you won't find that written down, but you can reason it out. But we'll start next time, we'll talk a little bit more about that, the treaty, and how it's gonna work out, and we'll finish the war off next time. So that will be next Monday's next class, right? So while everybody else is sweating out the exam, you guys get a break for 2 days. We'll have the exam on Wednesday, a week from today. Did you guys all see the thing about responders?